November 12, 1944, deep over the German industrial heartland, a single B-17 fortress sliced through a thin veil of clouds. The sky was a muted gray, sunlight struggling to penetrate the layer of mist, casting everything below in a cold, ghostly light. Inside the cramped waist gunner position, the world seemed impossibly distant and impossibly close at the same time. The drone of engines vibrated through the floor, the metallic tang of gun oil and heated brass filled the air, and every vibration threatened to throw off a fraction of an inch that could mean life or death. He peered along his Browning M2, noting the crooked mount that had earned skeptical looks during pre-flight checks. The hardware was slightly askew, misaligned from years of rough handling and hurried fixes, yet he had learned its quirks. Where others struggled to find their target, he could sense a plane before it fully emerged from clouds or smoke. Enemy fighters, black silhouettes darting against the gray, were visible to no one else. But through his eyes, guided by this unassuming crooked mount, they became tangible, their deadly patterns readable in midair. Below, factories and rail lines stretched like veins through the landscape. Every second, every twitch of the gun, every calculation mattered. And in that frozen altitude, with the wind whistling past, one waist gunner was about to turn a flaw into an edge that no one could have predicted. By late 1944, the Allied strategic bombing campaign had reached a pivotal stage. The skies over Germany were crowded with formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators, each laden with bombs intended to disrupt industrial output, rail networks, and fuel production. These missions were meticulously planned, often months in advance, but their execution remained perilously dependent on factors beyond the crew's control. Weather, flak, and the ever-present threat of Luftwaffe fighters. Daylight bombing, while offering precision, magnified vulnerability. Every bomber was a target, every formation a hunting ground. Waist gunners occupied some of the most precarious positions aboard the fortress. Isolated on the sides of the aircraft, they were exposed to wind and cold, the roar of engines, and the constant threat of incoming fighters. Their field of vision was limited by fuselage contours, and their firing arcs were constrained by the mounts and guns designed for the purpose. Each shot required split-second judgment, steady hands, and an intimate understanding of the gun's mechanics. In the chaos of combat, a minor misalignment or mechanical quirk could make the difference between a confirmed kill and wasted ammunition. German fighter tactics had evolved in response to the relentless Allied bombing. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf FW 190s were vectored by radar to intercept formations at predictable choke points. Flak from anti-aircraft batteries created corridors of danger, forcing bombers into precise altitude windows. Radar operators tracked formations, feeding coordinates to fighters with terrifying efficiency. Against this system, any deviation, even minor, could prove deadly. Enemy pilots were trained to exploit any momentary advantage, diving from above or behind, attacking the most exposed points. Often the waist and tail gunners. Within this environment, every technical detail mattered. Mounts, sights, and firing mechanisms were subject to inspection, maintenance, and improvisation. Crews quickly learned that standard hardware often failed under the stresses of high-altitude combat. A misaligned gun could throw rounds off target by feet at hundreds of yards. Yet with knowledge of the deviation, some gunners discovered they could anticipate trajectories that others could not. These minor quirks, overlooked by commanders and peers, sometimes became unexpected advantages. The squadron involved in this mission had flown dozens of sorties together. Their cohesion was built on routine, trust, and repetition. They understood each other's tendencies, reactions, and strengths. Commanders emphasized formation discipline, overlapping fields of fire, and coordination with neighboring planes. Each waist gunner, tail gunner, and flight engineer had a vital role to maintain collective safety. Yet amid these strict procedures, the inherent chaos of combat created opportunities for those willing to adapt. Our waist gunner, a quietly observant figure, had long noted the idiosyncrasies of his mount. Slightly crooked from wear, it had been the subject of jokes and skepticism during pre-flight inspections. Yet, in hundreds of practice sessions and missions, he learned its nuances, how a slight tilt changed sight alignment, how vibration altered impact points, and how rapid adjustments could compensate for enemy evasive maneuvers. Where others relied on mechanical perfection, he relied on intuition married to meticulous observation. Airborne reconnaissance reports indicated that the Luftwaffe had deployed additional radar-directed fighter groups to anticipated target zones. Anti-aircraft flak had intensified near key industrial centers, forcing bomber formations into more predictable paths. In this environment, the margin for error was microscopic. The waist gunner's mount, though unconventional, would become an unplanned variable capable of altering outcomes. It was an example of human adaptation meeting mechanical imperfection, where instinct and experience could outmatch training alone. As the formation climbed toward its assigned bombing altitude, every crew member checked instruments, ammunition belts, and personal gear. Engines droned, fuel lines thrummed, and oxygen flowed through masks. In that cold, pressurized world, precision was essential. For most, survival depended on procedure and repetition. For one waist gunner, however, a crooked mount promised an unpredictable edge, a secret advantage that could allow him to strike targets no one else could see. The stage was set for an engagement where skill, ingenuity, and minor imperfection would intersect with lethal consequence. The story of the crooked mount was not merely about hardware. It was about human adaptation under pressure, about understanding the interplay of mechanics, environment, and enemy tactics. And it was about to be tested in the harshest conditions imaginable, high above the heart of enemy territory. The specific squadron involved in this mission had earned a reputation for precision and resilience. Stationed at an airfield in eastern England, they were part of the 8th Air Force, tasked with long-range bombing raids deep into Germany. Their aircraft, B-17 Flying Fortresses, were among the most heavily armed and armored bombers of the war. Yet even these formidable machines were vulnerable to determined fighter attacks and the ever-present threat of flak. Every mission demanded careful coordination, but the human element, crew skill, split-second decisions, and improvisation often proved decisive. Among the crew, the waist gunners held positions that combined isolation with exposure. Located on either side of the aircraft fuselage, they had limited protection from the elements and were constantly in the line of sight of enemy fighters approaching from flanks or below. Unlike tail gunners or ball turret gunners, waist gunners often had to track fast-moving targets without the aid of powered turrets or stabilized platforms. Their success relied on eyesight, timing, and intimate knowledge of their gun mounts. Each bullet counted, and every second could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. Gun mounts were typically standardized, designed for durability and repeated firing. But the stresses of combat and high-altitude conditions often caused wear or misalignment. Some mounts would loosen, twist, or develop slight imperfections, usually corrected by ground crews before missions. Occasionally, crews improvised in the field, making minor adjustments or accepting quirks rather than waiting for repairs. While most deviations were considered flaws, some gunners learned to exploit these imperfections, turning a crooked sight into an intuitive advantage. The waist gunner in this story had spent months studying his mount, memorizing how its misalignment shifted trajectories under different firing angles and engine vibrations. While others sought perfect alignment, he treated the crooked mount as a tool, anticipating how it altered aim in ways that could allow him to target fighters obscured by clouds, sun glare, or smoke from anti-aircraft bursts. It was a secret familiarity born of observation, practice, and a willingness to challenge convention. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe had adjusted tactics in response to the relentless Allied bombing campaign. Radar stations, like the Freya and Würzburg networks, provided early warning of incoming formations, while fighter groups were scrambled to intercept bombers along predictable routes. The Germans often exploited the fixed patterns of formation flight, assuming that gunners relied solely on mechanical alignment rather than personal adaptation. In this cat-and-mouse game of aerial warfare, even minor deviations by an individual gunner could upset calculations, forcing fighters to react unpredictably. This mission in particular targeted heavily defended industrial complexes. Reconnaissance had shown dense flak batteries, coordinated radar tracking, and a high probability of multiple fighter engagements. Standard procedures emphasized tight formations, overlapping fields of fire, and adherence to assigned flight paths. Yet these doctrines, while effective, left little room for individual ingenuity. For one waist gunner, the crooked mount would provide that room, an unexpected factor that allowed him to see, aim, and strike in ways others could not. In the days leading up to the mission, the crew prepared meticulously. Ammunition belts were loaded and double-checked, guns were lubricated, oxygen systems tested, and instruments calibrated. Pre-flight drills simulated enemy engagement, but no exercise could replicate the exact conditions of real combat at altitude. The air was thin, engines vibrated under full power, and turbulence shifted the plane unpredictably. In these extreme circumstances, human skill and improvisation often proved more decisive than any mechanical advantage. By the time the squadron reached takeoff, every crew member understood their role in maintaining formation integrity and defensive coverage. The waist gunners, however, carried an additional, quiet confidence, an intimate knowledge of their mounts, and the hidden advantage of imperfection. This small deviation, unnoticed by others, would become the defining factor in the mission. The stage was now fully set. Precision, skill, and human ingenuity were about to intersect in the chaos of combat. A single crooked mount, a subtle misalignment, would enable a waist gunner to perform feats no one else could, altering the outcome of an engagement in the skies over enemy territory. The life of a waist gunner was one of isolation, exposure, and relentless tension. Unlike pilots, bombardiers, or flight engineers, they were stationed on the sides of the aircraft, where the thin aluminum skin provided minimal protection, and every gust of wind or vibration threatened to unsettle aim. The roar of 4 engines created a constant background hum, masking subtle cues from the surrounding sky. Gunners relied on instinct as much as sight, predicting enemy movements and compensating for aircraft sway, engine vibration, and their own fatigue. Psychological endurance was paramount. A waist gunner had no shield from fear. Each fleeting glimpse of a shadowy fighter could mean the difference between life and death. Long missions often exceeded 10 hours, with exposure to freezing temperatures at altitudes above 20,000 feet. Oxygen deprivation, exhaustion, and the monotony of scanning the skies compounded the stress. In this environment, small technical imperfections could become psychological anchors. The crooked mount, once a source of frustration, became an extension of his instincts, allowing him to operate with subtle confidence while others struggled with perfect alignment. Browning M250 caliber machine guns were powerful but demanding. The standard waist mount was rigid, designed to stabilize recoil and provide predictable ballistic trajectories. When the mount twisted slightly, as in this case, the line of sight shifted subtly. Normally, this would be considered a flaw, yet the waist gunner had spent months learning to account for the misalignment. He memorized how the rounds deviated depending on firing angle, aircraft attitude, and engine vibration. This intimate knowledge transformed a mechanical imperfection into an adaptive tool, enabling him to anticipate the trajectory of enemy planes even before they fully appeared in the field of view. The mount's crookedness altered recoil behavior in a way that smoothed bursts over moving targets. Where other gunners required multiple corrections, he could fire sustained bursts without losing accuracy. Combined with careful observation of cloud shadows, sun angles, and smoke from anti-aircraft fire, this allowed him to engage enemy aircraft that were nearly invisible to others. The technology, flawed in isolation, became lethal in skilled hands. Formation flying relied heavily on predictable patterns. Aircraft maintained strict positions to maximize overlapping defensive fire and minimize exposure to fighters. Enemy pilots studied these patterns meticulously, learning to exploit the predictable arcs of each gunner. The crooked mount introduced an unintentional tactical advantage. It allowed the waist gunner to target angles that other gunners could not cover. Enemy fighters approaching from less predictable vectors found themselves unexpectedly under fire. This advantage was magnified by altitude, speed, and formation configuration. The waist gunner's position allowed him to monitor a broad sector of sky that might be obscured by wings or engines for others. His precise, adapted firing technique created a lethal blind spot for the enemy. While the formation's standard tactics relied on uniformity, this single deviation in technique disrupted enemy expectations, providing a protective buffer for the squadron. Command decisions played a subtle but decisive role in enabling the waist gunner's improvisation. Squadron leaders emphasized strict adherence to formation and procedure, understanding that deviation could invite disaster. Yet experienced officers also recognized the value of individual initiative. Field adjustments, minor mechanical tweaks, or unconventional techniques were sometimes tolerated if they increased survivability without compromising the formation. The pilot's decision to allow the crooked mount to remain operational was less about lax oversight and more about pragmatic trust in crew judgment. This delicate balance between discipline and flexibility was critical. Leadership cultivated an environment where skilled gunners could exploit minor imperfections safely, reinforcing both morale and operational efficiency. Officers relied on debriefs and mission reports to verify effectiveness, rewarding ingenuity when it yielded tangible results. In this case, the waist gunner's unconventional use of his crooked mount was a direct outcome of a leadership culture that valued human judgment within the structured confines of combat. Doctrine, from the Luftwaffe perspective, the waist gunner's skill went largely unnoticed in the heat of engagement. Fighter pilots tracked the formation, anticipating standard defensive arcs, relying on speed, positioning, and radar guidance. The crooked mount introduced an unpredictable variable that disrupted their calculations. A well-timed burst from an unexpected angle forced evasive maneuvers, creating confusion among the attacking pilots. Enemy intelligence later noted anomalous losses in bomber formations, but lacked immediate explanation. Radar logs showed aircraft disappearing at angles that should have been covered by other gunners, and post-mission reports indicated pilots encountering defensive fire from seemingly impossible vectors. To the Luftwaffe, the phenomenon appeared as either luck, unseen gunners, or sheer coincidence, reinforcing the invisible advantage the waist gunner possessed. Using a crooked mount in combat was not simply a technical decision. It carried moral and psychological weight. Every shot fired meant life or death for both the enemy and his fellow crew members. Deviating from standard procedures risked disciplinary action, if unsuccessful, yet successful execution could protect the squadron from serious losses. The waist gunner navigated a constant mental calculus. Trust his instincts, exploit the mount's quirks, and act decisively, knowing that hesitation or error could be catastrophic. The crew's trust in him was vital. Each member relied on his judgment, aware that the mount's imperfections could be an asset rather than a liability. This mutual confidence strengthened cohesion and allowed collective focus under extreme pressure. The psychological impact extended beyond the mission. Confidence in improvisation reinforced resilience, cultivating a sense that ingenuity could tilt outcomes even in overwhelming circumstances. The convergence of human skill, Technical adaptation, tactical unpredictability, leadership tolerance, enemy miscalculations, and psychological trust set the stage for decisive action. The crooked mount was more than a flaw. It was a pivot point around which multiple elements interacted. Each angle, human, technical, tactical, leadership, enemy, moral, magnified the effectiveness of the others, creating a synergy that standard doctrine alone could not produce. In essence, the waist gunner's mount became a microcosm of warfare itself, a complex system of interdependent factors where subtle deviations could produce disproportionate effects. The combination of experience, observation, and calculated risk transformed an isolated mechanical imperfection into a tool capable of influencing the fate of a mission and the survival of dozens of crew members. The stage was now set for the encounter where these angles would collide with reality. Enemy fighters approached, flak erupted below, and the crooked mount, once a minor curiosity, would define the difference between deadly chaos and survival. Human ingenuity and mechanical imperfection were poised to meet the crucible of combat, and the moment of truth was imminent. The mission reached its critical phase as the B-17 formation approached the industrial heart of Germany. The sky was a patchwork of gray clouds and fleeting sunlight, casting shifting shadows across the armored fuselages. Anti-aircraft flak erupted from below in sudden bursts, black puffs against the pale horizon, each explosion sending shockwaves through the aircraft. The droning engines masked the terrifying whine of distant Messerschmitts closing in, yet the crew could feel their presence in the vibrations and the subtle shift of air currents. Inside the waist position, the gunner gripped his M2, noting every vibration, every micro-adjustment required to counteract the crooked mount. This was no ordinary engagement. Visibility was limited, targets were fleeting, and the slightest miscalculation could prove fatal. He monitored cloud edges, reflections, and shadows, anticipating the trajectory of enemy fighters before they fully emerged. Each plane that appeared in his line of fire demanded immediate calculation. Distance, speed, angle of approach, and recoil compensation. The formation shuddered as flak bursts grazed wings and fuselage, reminding the crew of the stakes. Other gunners fired sporadically, their bursts overlapping in chaotic arcs, yet the waist gunner's focus remained singular. He had trained for this, studied the mount, memorized the quirks, and internalized the subtle deviations. Where standard mounts required constant correction, his crooked mount allowed instinct to guide sustained fire with uncanny precision. Enemy fighters began breaking formation, darting from cloud cover with predatory speed. The waist gunner identified the first target partially obscured by a trailing wing. He adjusted for the crooked mount's misalignment, firing a controlled burst that intersected the fighter's path before the pilot could react. The explosion was almost imperceptible from his angle, but the movement of the enemy plane confirmed a hit. Others in the formation remained unaware of the precision unfolding beside them. Seconds expanded into an eternity as more aircraft appeared from the sunlit clouds. Each required split-second adjustments. Lead, elevation, timing, executed in rhythm with engine vibrations and gusts of wind. The gunner's mind operated in a blend of muscle memory, intuition, and mechanical understanding. The crooked mount, once considered a liability, became an extension of his perception, allowing him to engage targets before they were visible to anyone else. The pilot's commands maintained formation integrity, weaving the aircraft in minor altitude and lateral adjustments to minimize exposure to flak while preserving fields of fire. Crew coordination was flawless. Gunners communicated silently with eye contact and instinctive awareness. Bombardiers maintained heading, and engineers monitored engine performance. The synergy between crew and machine created a controlled environment within the chaos of combat. By now, enemy pilots realized something unusual was occurring. Tracers and impact bursts emerged from unexpected angles, forcing them into evasive maneuvers that disrupted planned attack vectors. One fighter clipped a wing, another veered sharply to avoid a burst it could not anticipate. The waist gunner's crooked mount was no longer merely a personal advantage. It was creating tactical confusion that radiated across the enemy formation. For the squadron, this became a test of nerve and coordination. The physical and mental strain was immense, yet the waist gunner's accuracy inspired confidence. Each confirmed hit not only reduced the enemy's immediate threat, but also reinforced the principle that improvisation, when applied with skill and timing, could override raw firepower. Where standard defensive procedures relied on overlapping arcs and rigid discipline, his mount introduced a fluid, adaptive element that others could not replicate. The initial flurry of combat revealed the lethal synergy of human perception and mechanical adaptation. Enemy fighters, accustomed to predictable defensive patterns, struggled to adjust. The waist gunner's crooked mount allowed him to cover blind spots, strike partially concealed planes, and anticipate evasive maneuvers with remarkable precision. The result was a series of engagements that seemed almost impossible. 3 enemy fighters downed in moments, before the larger formation could fully recognize the unfolding advantage. As the smoke and tracers filled the air, the squadron maintained cohesion. Pilots, gunners, and crew all acted as a single organism, each member aware of their role and trust in one another. The crooked mount, the human mind, and mechanical skill converged to produce a decisive edge in a scenario where conventional tactics alone would have left the squadron exposed. The stage was set for the next wave of action, where the waist gunner's mastery of his mount would be tested further, and where each successive shot could cement the survival of his comrades or risk catastrophic losses. The engagement escalated as additional Messerschmitts appeared from sun-drenched clouds, diving on the formation with lethal precision. Flak bursts punctuated the sky beneath, each explosion sending reverberations through the B-17's frame. The waist gunner's senses sharpened. Every vibration, every shadow, every faint reflection became vital information. His crooked mount, once derided as a flaw, now functioned as a subtle, intuitive guide. Each twitch of the gun reflected accumulated knowledge of angles, engine sway, and recoil patterns. The first enemy plane, partially obscured by the tail of a wingman, veered into his firing arc. The gunner anticipated the trajectory, factoring in wind, movement, and the mount's deviation. A short, controlled burst struck home. The fighter shuddered and spiraled, disappearing into the clouds below. Crew members barely noticed, focused on maintaining formation and scanning other quadrants, unaware of the precise, calculated work unfolding at their flank. Almost immediately, another fighter broke from cloud cover. Conventional mounts required multiple corrections, but the crooked alignment allowed the waist gunner to fire in rhythm with the aircraft's vibrations, adjusting instinctively for speed and distance. Tracers stitched through the sky, and the enemy fighter erupted in a column of smoke, twisting out of the attack pattern. A third fighter, approaching from an angle that should have been shielded by the bomber's wing, became visible only to the waist gunner. He adjusted for the subtle misalignment, tracking the plane as it attempted evasive maneuvers. With a calculated burst, the rounds found their mark. The fighter pitched violently, trailing fire, and vanished behind clouds. 3 enemy aircraft destroyed within 30 seconds. A remarkable feat that relied as much on adaptation and intuition as raw firepower. Around him, the squadron reacted to the chaos of flak and evasive fighters. Pilots maintained steady altitude, engines roared at full throttle, and gunners on other planes covered adjacent arcs. Coordination and trust ensured that each aircraft operated as a cohesive unit. Yet the crooked mount provided an advantage that no formal training or standard mount could replicate. It created an unpredictable vector of fire, forcing enemy pilots to confront threats they could not anticipate, altering the dynamics of the encounter. The waist gunner continued to fire in measured bursts, carefully monitoring the position of each incoming enemy fighter. Smoke trails, tracer lines, and fleeting glimpses of aircraft informed his targeting, while the mount's imperfection acted as a guide rather than an obstacle. Each engagement required split-second judgment, balancing aggression with caution. In these moments, the distinction between instinct and calculation blurred. He operated as both a component of the aircraft and a strategist within the squadron. Enemy pilots struggled to respond to the unusual defensive pattern. The unpredictable angles of fire forced repeated evasive maneuvers, fragmenting their attack cohesion. Standard Luftwaffe tactics, which relied on predictable arcs and overlapping fields of fire from bomber gunners, failed against the adaptive method provided by the crooked mount. What appeared to observers as luck was, in reality, a disciplined, mechanically informed instinct honed over months of experience. The formation pressed forward, dodging flak bursts and maintaining altitude, while the waist gunner continued to exploit his mount's quirks. Each subsequent engagement reinforced the tactical advantage. Enemy aircraft miscalculated approaches, veered off course, and sometimes retreated entirely. His contribution, though invisible to the wider squadron, had immediate consequences: reduced enemy pressure on vulnerable planes, fewer casualties, and a direct influence on mission success. In the span of mere minutes, the crooked mount had shifted the odds. 3 enemy aircraft downed in half a minute was extraordinary, but the deeper impact lay in disruption. The psychological effect on attacking pilots, the reprieve for the formation, and the validation of human ingenuity applied under extreme conditions. The waist gunner, alone yet integrated into the machine of war, demonstrated that adaptation, intuition, and disciplined observation could amplify the potential of even imperfect technology. As the formation cleared the heaviest zone of flak, the immediate crisis subsided, but the consequences were undeniable. Enemy losses were confirmed, formation integrity remained intact, and crew confidence soared. The crooked mount, once considered a liability, had become a decisive instrument of survival. It transformed isolated skill into collective advantage, proving that even small deviations, when mastered, could create disproportionate impact on the battlefield. The mission's conclusion marked the beginning of scrutiny, verification, and recognition. As the B-17 formation returned to base, the immediate relief of surviving unscathed was tempered by meticulous post-flight procedures. Crew members logged observations, recorded enemy contacts, and examined gun mounts and ammunition usage. The waist gunner, still seated in his cramped position, methodically inspected the crooked mount, noting its condition and function during the engagement. Every bolt, every angle, every subtle imperfection was now evidence of a method that had just proved decisive. Ground crews greeted the returning aircraft with practiced efficiency. They examined tracers, shell casings, and the physical wear of guns and mounts. The crooked mount, once dismissed as a flaw, now drew careful attention. Technicians and officers alike noted that its deviation had contributed to precise targeting at angles others could not reach. Maintenance logs highlighted unusual performance data, but corroborated the crew's testimony. This minor imperfection had, in fact, saved lives and neutralized enemy aircraft. Intelligence officers began piecing together reports from other formations in the same sector. Fighter engagements, radar logs, and post-mission reconnaissance confirmed unusual losses among Luftwaffe units. Enemy aircraft were downed at unexpected angles and altitudes, matching the waist gunner's account. His observations of enemy approach vectors aligned precisely with the flight data, confirming the credibility of claims once considered improbable. Debriefing sessions revealed the psychological impact on the squadron. The waist gunner's unusual method not only neutralized immediate threats, but also inspired confidence among the crew. Pilots and gunners recognized the value of adaptability and situational awareness, understanding that disciplined improvisation could provide survival advantages where standard procedures alone might fail. Crew trust deepened, reinforcing cohesion that would prove invaluable on subsequent missions. Commanders faced the delicate task of acknowledging the unorthodox method while maintaining operational discipline. The crooked mount was not standard, yet the results were undeniable. Reports emphasized the importance of human judgment and field adaptation, demonstrating that minor deviations, when combined with skill and observation, could produce strategic benefits. Leadership decisions highlighted a willingness to reward innovation while reinforcing formation integrity and procedural discipline. The broader operational consequences were becoming apparent. Enemy losses disrupted subsequent Luftwaffe sorties, forcing reallocation of fighter groups and adjustments to interception strategies. Radar operators and intelligence analysts noted anomalies, attributing them to either luck or undetected skill, unaware of the waist gunner's precise contribution. Meanwhile, lessons learned began to shape training, emphasizing not just hardware reliability, but the potential of individual initiative under extreme conditions. As reports filtered upward, higher command recognized the dual importance of mechanical familiarity and human adaptation. The waist gunner's achievement demonstrated a vital principle. Even minor imperfections, when understood and exploited with precision, could multiply operational effectiveness. This realization would influence discussions on gunnery tactics, mount maintenance, and training programs in bomber groups across the Air Force. The mission left the crew reflective but resolute. They had survived flak, fighters, and the unforgiving environment of high-altitude combat. Yet, the proof of ingenuity's power, the crooked mount, wielded with discipline and insight, lingered as the most remarkable aspect. It became a symbol of adaptation in a war dominated by machines, illustrating that human skill could turn imperfection into life-saving advantage. The consequences of the mission extended beyond the immediate squadron. Enemy air forces, startled by the unexpected precision of defensive fire, adjusted their tactics in response. Luftwaffe pilots reported confusion when attacking formations, encountering bursts from angles they had not anticipated. Radar operators documented losses at locations inconsistent with standard firing arcs, further validating the waist gunner's performance. Though the Germans could not identify the exact source, the psychological impact on fighter groups was tangible. Pilots became cautious, hesitation increased, and formations faltered under pressure. Back at base, the waist gunner's crew participated in detailed post-mission debriefs. Officers scrutinized his account, comparing flight logs, tracer patterns, and reported enemy losses. Confirmation of 3 enemy aircraft destroyed in 30 seconds was rare, almost unprecedented. Analysts noted that such efficiency from a single gunner was extraordinary, especially given the limited visibility and mechanical imperfection. The crooked mount had not merely enabled accurate fire, it had disrupted enemy calculations and forced adaptive responses that preserved the formation. The squadron itself reflected on the broader implications. Confidence in human ingenuity surged. Pilots and gunners recognized that precise observation, skillful adaptation, and calculated risk-taking could produce outcomes that rigid doctrine alone could not achieve. Training programs began to emphasize situational awareness, mechanical familiarity, and the potential advantages of minor improvisations in the field. Commanders incorporated lessons from the mission into operational planning, reinforcing the value of skilled individual judgment within the framework of formation discipline. Maintenance teams also gained insight. The crooked mount, previously viewed as a defect, became a case study in mechanical adaptation. It demonstrated how minor variations could yield unexpected tactical advantages if understood and exploited. Manuals and technical briefings began to reference the incident, highlighting that under certain circumstances, human adaptation could complement mechanical function, sometimes surpassing standardized performance. Reports of the mission circulated among other bomber groups. Stories of the waist gunner's unorthodox technique inspired a subtle cultural shift. Crews increasingly valued observation, improvisation, and mastery of individual roles. While discipline and procedure remained central to survival, the narrative underscored that ingenuity, when disciplined and informed, could enhance effectiveness and even save lives. The crooked mount became emblematic of this principle, a reminder that success often relied on the interplay between human skill and imperfect tools. Enemy response continued in subsequent sorties. Fighters adjusted attack angles, radar operators recalculated approaches, and commanders implemented revised engagement strategies. Yet even these adaptations could not entirely neutralize the effect. The waist gunner's unique application of his mount introduced unpredictability that persisted, ensuring that his squadron retained a protective edge in engagements to come. Ultimately, the mission validated several critical lessons about aerial warfare. Human initiative could magnify minor mechanical deviations. Precise observation and adaptation could disrupt enemy tactics. And ingenuity under pressure was as essential as firepower or formation discipline. The aftermath solidified the waist gunner's contribution not just as a tactical success, but as an enduring example of how understanding, observation, and creativity could redefine expectations in high-stakes combat. With enemy losses confirmed, squadron cohesion intact, and lessons absorbed, the stage was set for the reflective conclusion. The mission had transformed minor imperfection into a decisive advantage, leaving a legacy of ingenuity, trust, and human skill that would resonate far beyond a single engagement in the skies. The story of the crooked mount demonstrates that warfare is as much about human ingenuity as it is about technology. In the vast theater of World War II, where meticulous planning, radar tracking, and firepower dominated the battlefield, a single waist gunner's understanding of his imperfect gun mount turned an apparent flaw into a decisive tool. It illustrates the subtle truth of combat, that minor deviations, when mastered with skill and observation, can create outsized impact. The waist gunner's actions reveal the interplay of instinct, preparation, and adaptation. His ability to anticipate enemy movements, exploit mechanical quirks, and act decisively transformed a routine mission into a remarkable success. The crooked mount, initially viewed as a liability, became an extension of his perception, allowing him to target aircraft invisible to others. Each burst, each calculated adjustment, relied on a fusion of human judgment and mechanical understanding, a convergence rarely acknowledged in conventional training. Beyond technical mastery, the incident highlights the psychological and moral dimensions of war. The trust among the crew, their reliance on one another, and the willingness to embrace calculated risk were as crucial as the gun itself. Leadership that tolerated measured improvisation enabled innovation while preserving discipline. Enemy fighters, unprepared for the unpredictable angles of fire, experienced confusion and disruption, reinforcing that human ingenuity can challenge even the most methodical adversary. The legacy of this engagement extends beyond a single mission or confirmed kills. It influenced training protocols, operational doctrine, and the collective understanding of adaptation in high-stakes aerial combat. The crooked mount became a symbol of how imperfection, when understood and applied with skill, could become an advantage. It reminds us that the effectiveness of technology is inseparable from the humans who wield it, and that creativity, courage, and observation can tip the balance between survival and catastrophe. Ultimately, the tale of the waist gunner is a testament to resilience, ingenuity, and the quiet heroism of individuals operating in extreme conditions. In the vast, perilous skies over enemy territory, where mechanical precision and strategic planning often dictated outcomes, it was one man's mastery of imperfection that saved lives, disrupted the enemy, and left a lasting mark on the understanding of aerial warfare. His story endures as a reminder that even minor quirks, when combined with skill and instinct, can become instruments of extraordinary impact.